What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into some of my cards that I've kind of went through and looked at in Dominaria United and kind of make my picks for what maybe you should look at when it comes to crafting these cards. I will say this before diving into the video that I haven't playtested any of these cards, and it's one of those things you can kind of speculate on what cards will be good. But I do think some of these cards right off the bat by what they do initially should see some play in some way or manner. In the most part, when it comes to the new meta, I think a lot of these cards do a pretty decent job of replacing other cards that may be leaving the format. And it's definitely one of those things that I do think, there's other cards that I don't have here on the list when it comes to rares and mythics that, are still playable. I'm not saying those cards are bad. I just figured I'd narrow it down as quickly as possible, so I'm not having a list of all the rares and mythics and talking about how many I would craft, just because I don't want to make the video an hour plus long. I don't even know how long this video will be, but with that being said, let's just dive into the cards and let's just start talking about them. So the first card up on the list is going to be Anointed Peacekeeper. This is kind of like the Elite Spellbinder replacement card, though it's not exactly the same thing as Elite Spellbinder. It is a 3-mana 3/3 card with Vigilance, and as it enters the battlefield, you get to look at target opponent's hand, and you get to choose any card name. So you don't have to choose a card that's in their hand, but you can choose any card name. So if you get an idea of what kind of deck they're playing, you maybe can go after another card that they may not have drawn yet, and that they possibly could draw, and kind of choose that name if you want to, or just choose, if you want to do the easy thing and just choose something in their hand, you could do that as well. Spells your opponent's cast with the chosen name cost 2 more to cast. So if you choose maybe their 3-drop, if you're on the play, you can choose their 3-drop and essentially tax it for 2 additional mana that now costs 5 mana instead of 3, which essentially maybe throws them off, if they're playing pretty much a 1-2-3 curve for the most part as well. And then activate abilities of the chosen name cost 2 more to cast to activate unless they're of mana abilities. So this is one of those things, right? It's not like Elite Spellbinder that card's permanently taxed. So if your opponent has a way to get rid of Anointed Peacekeeper, that card loses that additional tax and therefore goes back to its original casting cost. That's I guess the one downside compared to Elite Spellbinder. But still, all in all, this is kind of like not a one-to-one, but a pretty similar kind of effect that you're trying to do to your opponent. I think the added benefit here as well is that this card doesn't have flying, though it has Vigilance and also has 3 toughness, which is kind of an up from Elite Spellbinder, because the downside is that Elite Spellbinder always had 1 toughness. It only took a shock of here, or maybe a Meathook Massacre for 1 to kind of really get that Elite Spellbinder out of the air. But all in all, I do think this is be one of those cards, if you are someone who plays mono white and you're looking for that replacement for Elite Spellbinder, this is definitely something you want probably a set of, as I do think this card's going to be really good. As well as this card's not legendary, so you can have as many of these as you draw on the battlefield at a given time, therefore taxing a lot of your opponent's cards out of playability range. And on top of that, if you actually stack this ability on the same card over and over again, that card would essentially cast 2 additional for every time you actually would have said ability. But all in all, a good card. I would say definitely a playable card, especially if you're a mono white player looking for that replacement. So the next card up is going to be Defiler of Faith. Now this is one I'm not 100% sold on, but I do like the Phyrexian mana ability of it. It is a 5-mana 5/5. As additional cost to cast white permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost 1 white less to cast if life was paid this way. This effect only reduces the amount of white mana to cast to play, so you'd still have to pay the colorless cost of your white spells afterwards. And the secondary ability is that whenever we cast a white permanent spell, meaning anything that would stick on the battlefield outside of lands, outside of lands, you would essentially get the trigger effect, which is you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. And this, to me, is one of the weaker versions of all the Defilers that we'll have, but I do like that ability, that especially in an aggressive deck, this is a good card to have because, maybe your life portal is not always in jeopardy, especially if you're on the aggro. And this essentially turns a lot of your cards that may be a little bit more expensive, where, let's just say you have a 4-drop that has double white. You can pay 4 life and pay 2 colorless, and that leaves you the opportunity to have 2 mana open to play something else so you can multi-spell in the same turn. I do think the idea of paying life, especially if you're being the aggressor, is definitely a good way to go, especially if if you feel like your life points aren't really in jeopardy. Though I would say this is probably the weaker of the batch, as I do think, depending on the color, there's some that are really, really good. This one maybe not as good, because getting an additional 1/1 is is okay, but it's not anything like, wow, that's amazing kind of thing. Also, I'd probably say with this one, you probably only need like a couple copies, like 1 to 2. It also depends on where you curve out. You know, is this going to be, this is not a card you want 4 of in the deck if you're a really aggressive low drop deck, like kind of how mono white is. It's kind of like this is your top end to hit, and then kind of allows you to kind of be more aggressive as the game goes on. So like I said, probably like 2 copies at most, even though it's not a legendary creature. Next card up is Guardian of New Benella. This is a 2-mana 2/2 creature. It has the Enlist ability, which is that ability that you can tap a creature that you control as this card is attacking and give that power to this creature. And what happens is whenever you do that, you get to scry 2, which is always good, you know, especially in aggro decks. You want to make sure you're drawing, you know, keeping that pressure on, or possibly even draw a mana if you really, really need it. And you can also discard a card and give it indestructible end of turn, and you tap it. So this is a unique ability as well. So you can attack in with this and still discard a card, and you already attacked in with it, so it's already tapped. So the additional tap ability is not anything you know, crazy. You know, it's just one of those things that if your opponent does it before combat, it's going to tap it down, therefore it can't attack. But you're not going to have to worry about, worrying about that effect. But it's still a really good card. The idea here that you have the ability for 2/2 that can get stronger and have possible indestructibility is always very good. Though the indestructibility is not going to prevent this thing from dying from Meathook Massacre, so it's still very susceptible to that or any other cards that are in the format that will give it a minus that's greater than 2. So that's just the only thing I would say to look out for. But I do think overall, if you're an aggressive deck and you're looking for something that's pretty decent, and maybe you have 2 creatures like this one and like a smaller creature that really can't attack into a creature, but if you tap that smaller creature and attack with this and make this creature bigger, maybe that's where the play is. And then on top of that, like I said, you do get the ability to scry 2. And there's another card on the list that I do think, even though you're discarding cards into your graveyard, that actually may not be the worst thing ever, just because I do think this other card kind of benefits from the fact that you have to, discard cards to keep this thing on the board with its indestructibility. And that card's gonna be Sarah Paragon. Now, this is like one of my favorite mythics, I think, of the set. I do think this is actually a very powerful mythic in the fact that it's a 4-mana 3/4 flyer. And once during each of your turns, you may cast a land from your graveyard or cast a permanent spell with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard. And if you do, it gains whenever this permanent would be put into graveyard from anywhere, exile, and gain 2 life. So this is kind of that card that I do think kind of goes with the prior card, in the fact that, all those cards you're possibly discarding it to keep it on the battlefield. This allows you to then replay those cards. If you discard a land card, you can replay that land. If you discarded, a creature card, you can recast that creature card from the graveyard. It's kind of like a Lurrus in a way. If you've been playing MTG since Lurrus was a thing, the ability to play things from the graveyard, especially in a deck where you're being aggressive, maybe you now can attack it even more aggressively if you know that you're going to be able to possibly recast those things. It's definitely be very good. I really like this card. And I think the fact that it's 4 mana and it's a 3/4, I think is definitely very, very strong. And this is definitely a card that you're going to want some copies of it if you are playing that low curve kind of style aggro deck, as this card's going to make those cards, even though they may trade with other creatures, it's going to give you that additional ability that you can recast those things from your graveyard, because it would essentially hit everything that is mana value 3 or less. So this is probably a must. I don't know if this is a 4 of, but I would probably say it's up there. Maybe it's a 4 of, as it's not legendary, so it's definitely good. It's just one of those things that I do think turns like the tide when, it's always terrible that you get Meathook Massacred, but maybe you can follow it up by playing this Paragon and then possibly even then replaying something that may have been Meathook Massacred off the battlefield, essentially giving you pressure again. And that's why I think this card is just that good. Overall, like I said, I think this is a 4 of, but, it is a mythic, so mythic cards, just like rare cards, are definitely hard to come by. But I think this will be a good card that you'll see a lot of play, especially in the aggressive deck. The next card up is going to be Temporary Lockdown. And this is another card that I think is going to be really good, right? If you're more of a mid-range to slower deck like Control, this is going to be a good card that's going to help you maybe, catch up against those more aggressive decks that play low-cost creatures, as is a 3-mana enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield, exile each non-land permanent mana value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. So it's kind of like a portable hole, but in a massive scale. And I do think this is why this card's going to be really good. If you're playing against a deck that has a bunch of tokens, it's going to get rid of all those tokens. Not just like creature tokens, it'll get rid of blood tokens, treasure tokens, any sort of tokens it'll get rid of immediately. It'll get rid of any small creatures. And I do think that's what makes this card so good. And I do think if you are playing like a control deck or a mid-range deck and you're kind of just looking to survive to get into your sweet spot, this will be that card that will help you kind of, get there. It doesn't hit, things that are 3 drops or higher. So, there are some cards that will still be, kind of, you'll have to find some other ways to deal with. But like I said, being able to deal with that early game and just one fell swoop without really, having to do too much is definitely good. And the fact that this is a 3-mana, essentially Oblivion Ring, but for everything with 2-mana value 2 or less is overall very, very good. I would also say this is probably something that you probably want 4 of, right? If you're a control player or a mid-range player that plays white, this is probably something you want to make sure you draw if you're not playing a lot of ways to really remove things on the battlefield, as this will be that card that kind of helps you do that. So the next card up, we dive into blue, and now we go up with the blue Defiler. This is Defiler of Dreams. It's a 5-mana 4/3 flyer that has additional cost to cast a permanent spell. You may pay 2 life. Those spells cost 1 blue blast to cast. It only reduces the blue mana cost and their casting cost. This one's actually not bad either, though I would say the one downside to this, for 5 mana, you only get a 4/3, which means it's very susceptible to spot removal, as Lightning Strike is a card that's going to be reprinted, so this will get Lightning Strike very easily. It could also get Strangled. Doesn't have any sort of ward or anything. And just like the white one, I do think this is one that's going to be slightly a little bit on, the bottom side of all the Defilers, as, like I said, I think that it's not the ability of whenever you cast a blue permanent spell that you get to draw a card. I do think it's the ability, the fact that this card only has 3 toughness, and you're paying 5 mana for it, and that's kind of why I do think this is kind of on the bottom of it. This is also probably one that you probably only need a couple copies of in any deck that you're playing this, as it only benefits you when you cast some blue permanent spells. It's not a card that you probably play control, but if you're playing any sort of deck that plays blue that's more on the aggro side, like if you're still playing like Esper aggro, or you're maybe playing like a tempo style deck with like Is It Tempo or even Selesnya, any of the sorts like that, this is kind of like that card that you want as your top end, as will let you make all those aggressive spells that you're trying to cast. If you're not really worried about life total, you'll be able to cast it with life, and then you'll leave mana open to possibly do other things with it. And then on top of that, whenever you cast those blue permanent spells, you get to draw a card, so it kind of gives you that tempo effect. But still, nonetheless, it's still an okay card, but you don't need too many copies of it to really make a deck work with it. Now, the next card up is going to be Hottie Jin. And now when I saw this card, this is kind of one of those cards that I was a big fan of. It's a 3-mana star 4 flyer that its power is equal to the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard, and then on top of that, your instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast. And this is why I think this card is that good. It turns all your like a lightning strike into a 1-mana lightning bolt, essentially, which is good. On top of that, every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell, this thing's gonna get bigger and bigger, and that means your opponent has to deal with it. I guess the only downside to it is it doesn't have like any sort of protection on itself, though I would say if it did, it'd probably be Mythic or something like that. But it's one of those things that you look at the cards that we have in the format that are ways to protect, especially in blue. You mix that in with maybe either white or even like green or even red. There's definitely ways that you're going to be able to protect this card and kind of pump it up in the process. I do think some sort of tempo deck is perfect for this card, just because those tempo decks, you're trying to play a balance of non-creature spells on top of creatures. Like, if you're playing like Delver, this is a perfect card for Delver. This kind of reminds me of like Crackling Drake from Ravnica. This is like one of those cards that I think is going to be good. There's a lot of decks that, there's a lot of non-creature spells in these colors, like in blue, in red, in white, or even green, that you can play this card and definitely get some benefit out of. Overall, I think this is a card, if you're playing like a tempo style deck, or a deck that's going to be playing like blue but in the more aggro side, this is definitely a must add, I would say, overall. I think the ability of not it only getting bigger and bigger as you play more instants and sorceries, but the idea that it also makes your other spells that you're casting that are instants and sorceries that much cheaper to cast, it definitely makes this card a solid like must for have add of in your particular deck that you're playing this card in. I just think there's a lot of upside to this card, and if you play multiples of these, that's even more mana that you have to pay in order to actually cast those spells. So definitely an overall 4 of in most decks. Then this is like another, this is an interesting mythic that I'm unsure really where it is. It kind of reminds me of Necro Duality for zombies, but this kind of is one of those spells that I think could be really good, because this is kind of one of those spells you play in decks that aren't of a particular creature type. And the card is Vesuvian Diplomacy. It's a 4 mana. Whenever you cast a spell that targets only a single artifact and or creature we control, create a token that's a copy of that artifact or creature, except it's not legendary. And this is definitely unique as well. Like, let's just say you play a slip out the back on a creature you control. Now you get to create a copy of that creature now slipping out the back, which is definitely going to be pretty interesting. And it's definitely going to make it hard for your opponent to really deal with the board state unless they have some sort of way to, either follow up that spell with another spell. But you're still going to get an additional copy out of it. And I do think this is kind of one of those cards, like if you are playing like a deck that you're playing a lot of spells that target creatures you control that you're targeting them, not your opponent. this is gonna be one of those spells you're gonna get a lot of use out of. And I do think like if you're playing like a tempo deck that plays blue, this is definitely like like at least 2 copies of. I don't know if you can go up to 4 copies. 4 drops in a more of a tempo deck. You want to kind of like leave your mana open, but I do think this is kind of like a way to make that tempo deck kind of go over the finish line, because I do sometimes think that when you run out of gas, it makes it harder to kind of finish off your opponent. But this is gonna be one of those cards that makes those decks maybe that much better, because now you're getting additional copies of said cards, which makes this card overall very, very good. And like I said, probably 2 copies is enough, but you could make a set of 4 if you really, really want to, but still a good card to say the least. Now moving on to black, we get to Braid's Artisan Nightmare. It's a 3 mana 3/3. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a opponent that shares a creature that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. To me, this card's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of one of those cards that I don't know if it's going to see a ton of play, but I do like Braids overall and just like Magic's history. I figured I'd mention it here on the list. It is a legendary creature. It's probably something that, because it's legendary, don't play more than 3 of if you're ever going to play it. But I probably see this being as a 1 or 2 of in a deck. And the one deck that I kind of see this card possibly making a home in is possibly something like the Anvil deck, as that deck is actually pretty interesting in the fact that if you think about it, if you play the Anvil deck and you sacrifice an artifact creature, it makes your opponent have to either sacrifice an artifact and or a creature, and then if they don't, they lose 2 life and you get to draw a card. So that's kind of where I see it. And that's a deck that experiments around with Ob Nixilis in the 3-drop slot, and that card feels okay. But is this kind of like one of those cards that maybe helps out that deck? I don't really know, but it's definitely a card to experiment with in, like, say, that deck. It's also another card if you're playing some sort of like mono black pile. This is a card that could be a 1-off or a 2 of in the deck, just as that other way to finish off your opponent, allowing you to also get some sort of card draw out of it. But definitely an overall decent card, to say the least. Is it probably going to be, like I said, the best card? Probably not, but having 2 copies of this in your collection to kind of throw in a deck is definitely very good. And worst case scenario, if you are someone who plays Commander, having at least a single copy in your collection and possibly playing it as a Commander is also not that bad, because it is a legendary creature and could be a Commander, to say the least. So the next card up is the Defiler of Flesh. This is the other Defiler, but for black. It is a 4 mana 4/4 menace, which is definitely pretty good. It's also 1 mana cheaper than the other ones we've gone over so far in the video. And like the other ones, you can pay 2 life instead of paying black mana in the casting cost of spells you control. It only pays the black mana of those spells, but whenever you cast a permanent spell, target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains menace end of turn. This one's not bad either. I would say this is probably somewhere in the middle. It's probably the 3rd best overall. It's not in the top, it's in the top 3, but there's only 5 colors, so it's number 3 for me. And this is the reason why I say this one's pretty good, because you look at cards like, let's just say, Tenacious Underdog. You look at a way to play like a more aggressive, like mono black aggro. I think this is kind of a card that helps you make that deck more aggressive, right? You turn like a Tenacious Underdog into a 4/3 menace creature that your opponent has to commit 2 creatures to. It's definitely a good card. I do think it's one of those things that I believe if you blitz that Tenacious Underdog, the trigger goes on the stack, but I believe the Underdog's on the battlefield, and you'll be able to put that +1/+1 counter on it, give it menace, and then attacks it for 4, which is definitely sweet. I do like this idea of paying life in order to get some sort of advantage is always very good. And this one being mana cheaper is, to me, why it's better than the other ones we've gone over so far in the video. It's kind of that, it's better than the other 2 because it's cheaper, but it's not, anything that's mind-blowing, to say the least, when it comes to playing the black spells and getting that additional effect. But still an overall good, I would say. If you're playing a mono black deck, this may be like a deck that you want. That's probably a card you want 4 of. Depending on if you're playing other colors, maybe you have like 2 of, so probably it's in that 2 to 4 range when it comes to how many you want to craft, but still a good card, to say the least. So the next card up is Drag to the Bottom. Now this one I'm actually really, really big fan of. I think when I actually went through the spoilers, this is kind of the ones I talked about a lot. To me, this is kind of like going to be the replacement for Meathook Massacre post-rotation, when Meathook Massacre finally rotates out of the format. But this card's really, really good, right? If you're a 3-color deck or more, this card's going to be really, really good for your deck, because for 4 mana, you essentially get to give target creature -X at end of turn, where X is 1 plus the number of basic land types among lands you control. And in this set, combined with Triomes, we have a decent amount of ways to produce, said lands, and it's not basic lands. So if a card says that it's like a swamp, plains, and a blue mana, that's 3 mana right there. So this can at least be a 4 mana -4/-4 to the whole board, which is definitely very good. It's kind of like a Languish, I believe, is the card I'm thinking of. That's like this similar effect. And if you are able to somehow sneak and get 2 more colors in here, or 2 more basic land types or land types into the battlefield, and possibly get this 2 possibility of being a -6/-6 across the board. It's definitely not bad compared to when you think of like a Meathook Massacre for having to then pay the 2 black mana plus whatever. You essentially have to cast it for 8. This is possibility of getting to that, but for only 4 mana. And it definitely varies depending on what lands you have on the battlefield. But this is still really, really good. I think like this is a card that you want to play you must have to play in a deck that's playing 3 colors. If you're playing Sultai, if you're playing Esper, this is a good card to kind of wipe the battlefield. And you will definitely get there because you're probably playing Triumphs to kind of get that mana fix so that you can play those cards. So I would say this is a 4 of. I'm a big fan. I think this is a card that will get better, especially when Meathook Massacre leaves the battlefield. And -X/-X abilities are always very good just because it gets around indestructibility. So definitely good in that sense as well. And the next card up is going to be Evolved Sleeper. Now this is essentially the Ascendant Spirit, but for black. It's a 1 mana 1/1 that you can spend mana into and level it up. Basically, for 1 mana you make it a 2/2. For 2 mana, you make it a 3/3, and it gains all these other additional power types, which makes it very, very good. And then for 3 mana, this is kind of like you can keep on pumping it into this kind of effect where you give it a +1/+1 counter on it. You get to then draw a card and lose a life. This is going to be a good card, right? As the one thing I would say that black lost a lot is that 1-drop slot, and I do feel like this is going to be that card no matter what kind of mono black deck you are playing or a deck that plays black mana. This is going to be one of those cards that kind of fits well in that 1 mana slot because it's a card that if you have an open turn, you can spend the mana to then invest into it and grow it. And this is one of those things you can do at instant and or sorcery speed if you want to. So you can kind of wait and see what your opponent does. If they go to kill it, do maybe 1 point of damage to it. You can then pump it, make it a 2/2, then it doesn't die kind of thing. It's overall very, very good. I do like cards like this. I do like the fact that it doesn't have the restriction of that it only can be done in your turn, which makes it much better. And this is, to me, this is a 4 of, especially if you're a player who plays black mana. This is definitely a card that can fit in both like more the mid-range and also the more aggro side of things. And for only having to invest 1 black mana initially to play it and then up to 2 mana later in the game, I do think this is like a card that can be played in multitude of color decks. You know, it can be played in a monocolor deck, a 2-color deck, or even a 3, 4, 5 color deck. I would say, you know, this is kind of one of those cards that feels pretty good and gets better as the game goes on. So, like I said, a 4 of at best in most decks are just to have in your collection overall. Now, the next card up is going to be Shroldred the Apocalypse, a 4 mana 4/5 Death Toucher, which to me is, you know, it's pretty good to say the least. Not anything super crazy, but still an overall very, very good card. Whenever we draw a card, we gain 2 life. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. So I do think that's what's so good about it, right? It's one of those things that every turn that your opponent goes, even if this thing doesn't really attack in, their opponent's going to lose 2 life just on their draw step unless they remove it or bounce it or something like that. I really like this card. It's a great card, has a big toughness. You know, 4/5 is definitely hard to get rid of. The fact that it's Death Touch, you can sit back and block all day if it really, really wants to. And the fact that you're gaining life and also making your opponent lose life without really having to do too much is definitely good, to say the least. It's one of those things, because it is legendary, you can only have 3 copies of it, you know, 1 copy out on the battlefield. It's probably like no more than 3 in a deck. So, you know, it's probably, you know, really 2 is probably the most ideal spot, but you can still, you know, craft up to 3 copies. If you really like it that much, you could possibly even craft 4 copies, but it's a very solid card to play in your 4-drop slot in any deck that plays black. It's a good card. It'll definitely, you know, frustrate your opponent because your opponent's going to be slowly draining life, and if you're in a more aggressive deck, you're going to be able to push more damage on them. So I do think this card's really, really good. Even though, you know, it's not really anything super crazy, you're going to get super value once you play it. It's going to be one of those cards that makes the game, you know, go quicker because it's attacking it's every turn your opponent's getting taxed and you're gaining life in the process. So definitely a card I would say 2 of. But like I said, you know, it's not out of the range that you would want 3 or 4 copies of this in your collection. Next card up is going to be the Stronghold Arena. It's a 2-mana enchantment that has a kicker of green and or white. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life for each time it was kicked. So if you are playing like, you know, a deck that plays either green mana, white mana, or both, especially and black, it's definitely a good card. Each time it's kicked, you gain 3 life. So if you kick it once, you gain 3 life. If you kick it twice, you gain 6 life, which is very good. And then whenever one of our creatures deal combat damage to an opponent, you may reveal a top card of your library and put it into your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. So this essentially is an enchantment that is kind of like Sorin's +1, but built into a creature. Are built into an enchantment, I should say. So it's kind of like one of those things that you could either play this, you play Sorin, you can also play it on turn 2, you can play it on turn 3, you can play it on turn 4. So it does have that flexibility that the Sorin doesn't have, where Sorin's just a lockdown turn 4 play. You could also play both of them together if you really, really want to be that aggressive when it comes to your draws. I really like this card. You know, if you're a more aggressive deck, you kind of want to make sure you keep that tempo going, and paying life in the process of, you know, digging a little bit deeper into your deck by, you know, is really good, right? You know, 2 mana, you know, possibility of losing 2 life, losing 3 life, possibly losing 4 life. Not really the greatest. But the idea here is, if you play it early, you don't gain any life out of it. The later you play it, the more life you possibly could gain, and it gets better if you're playing green and white. It's another card that could fit in a domain style deck, where you're possibly playing 3 colors, if not more. And this is one of those cards that benefits from that said deck. It just helps you find answers, and if you're pushing damage on your opponent, you'll definitely find your answers before probably lose all the life, unless they're also being super aggressive to your life points, which is not really the greatest thing. But still, I say this is a card that if you are playing that kind of strategy, you probably want 4 of. 2 mana enchantment is something you definitely want to draw, and like I said, it gets better as the game goes on. So overall, very, very good card. So now we move into red, and we have the red Defiler. This one's Defiler of Instinct. It's a 4 mana 4/4 for striker. I think this is probably the second best overall, just because of the fact that it's a 4 mana, it's a 4/4, also is for strike, which makes it good. As additional cost to play, any red spell, you can pay 2 life instead of making it cost red less to pay, depending on how many times you got rid of it. You still have to pay the colorless. But still, that ability is going to be very, very good, especially in aggressive decks. Whenever you cast a red permanent spell, Defiler of Instinct deals 1 damage to any target. And the reason why, like I said, I like this one is, 1, it's a 4 mana cost for a 4/4, which is still really good for a strike. Doesn't have haste, only downside in like a red deck where you probably want to be aggressive. I also like the fact that when you cast a red permanent spell, which a lot of your like mono red aggro decks or any sort of decks that play red having the ability to also points of damage here and there. You get sort of chump blockers. You can go right to your opponent's life total, tap a planeswalker with that 1 point of damage. So it definitely is one of those things that is definitely well versed, and can be used in multitude of ways depending on the game state situation. And like I said, it's probably the second best out of all of them. I just like it overall. Just like I said, it's a good card. If you're probably playing this in a red deck or a deck that plays red, maybe it's a 2 of, maybe it's a 4 of. It's probably in that 2 to 4 range, I would say. It's not legendary, so you can have as many as you want out on the battlefield at one given time. And I think this is one of those cards that has a lot of upside once you get 1 out on the battlefield, just because it allows you to be that much more aggressive after this is out, where you can play this on turn 4 and then follow that up on turn 5 and play a whole bunch of cards, to kind of put a lot of pressure on your opponent's life point total. Next card up is going to be Jaya, Fiery Negotiator. Now, to me, she's probably the best planeswalker out of this, as, Karn's not really that great. And I think, Liliana is good, but in today's, standard climate, I don't know if she's as good as she once was when she was originally printed. I think Jaya has a lot of, benefits in the style of decks I like to play. It's a 4 mana, 4 loyalty planeswalker. Its +1 abilities, you create a 1/1 red monk creature token with prowess, which means every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get to give that creature +1/+1 to end a turn. -1, you exile top 2 cards of your library. Choose one of them. You may play that card this turn, so it has a way to dig a little bit deeper, possibly finding an answer or card that you can cast on your turn, which is also very good. And then the -2 is really good as well, that whenever choose target creature an opponent controls, whenever you attack, it deals that much damage equal to the amount of attacking creatures to said creature. So it's when you declare those attacks, that points of damage will go to that creature, which may give you a lane to go into your opponent's life total, which is definitely very good. And the -8 is also really good, that, you get an emblem with whenever you cast a red instant or sorcery spell, copy it twice. You may choose new targets for said copies. It's great. The one thing I would say is this card going to have a lot of flexibility in a lot of decks it could probably play? Probably not, but I would say out of all the planeswalkers, to me, it has a lot of versatility in what it can do. It's probably like a card that's meant for those tempo style decks or decks that are playing a mixture of aggro and also non-creature spells. I'll probably play it in like an is a tempo pile. Mono red pile, definitely probably include copies of this, just because I do think it fits in there, just because you're playing a balance of burn spells and creatures, and burn spells to play on creatures, which definitely helps out your +1 ability of it, and you're always looking for ways to dig a little bit deeper into your deck, and this is kind of that card that helps you get there. So to me, this is probably the best planeswalker out of the set. And I do think this is going to be one, if you are playing like any of those decks, is going to be one that you want 3 to 4 copies of in your deck, just to make sure you draw it, because I do think when you draw it, it kind of turns the game in your favor, and your opponent now has to deal with not only the planeswalker, but possibly any other threats you have on the battlefield, which kind of could finish the game pretty quickly, and I do like Jaya, Fire Negotiator overall. Next card up is going to be Keldon, Flame Sage. It's a 3 mana 2/3 with the enlist ability. That means whenever you attack with it, you get to tap another creature you control and give its power to said creature. And this becomes, whatever that tap creature's power is, and still has 3 toughness. But when this attacks, you get to look at top X cards of your library. X is its power. You can exile an instant or sorcery card with mana value X or less from among them. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in any random order. You may cast exile a card without paying its mana cost. So this is a card I really, really like, in the sense that it's kind of like one of those things that you attack in. If you're a deck that is on the tempo side, there's a lot of cards you can hit for the 2 or even 1 mana. And the more power it has, the more spells it possibly could hit. It could hit a lightning strike. It could hit just a play with fire. It could hit a slip out the back. It kind of hit some decent spells that definitely can help you out overall. I like it. I know it doesn't have haste. I know it's kind of like a very pointed thing. This is going to be in a deck that also is going to probably play Jaya. I like the enlist ability because sometimes you get like tokens or something. You can always tap the token down, give it the 1 additional power, which is definitely very good there. But overall, it's a great card. This is a card that you could play in a 3-drop slot in like those prowess style decks. I would say it's probably in that 2 to 4 range. I'd probably play 4 of them in a deck and kind of experiment from there and probably whittle them down depending on how it feels overall. But it's still a good card. Overall, decent card. I would probably, like I said, it's in the 2 to 4 range is where I would craft it. So definitely, I would say a card that, you definitely want to keep an eye on, especially if you're someone who also likes to play those like prowess or spell, creature, non-creature spell type deck. Next card up is going to be Radha's Firebrand. Now, this is a 2-mana 3/1 creature that's a human warrior that whenever it attacks target creature defendant player controls with power less than Radha Firebrand's power can't block this turn. So it has a built-in ability that kind of locks down one creature from blocking if it's less power than Radha. And it also has the main ability of 6 mana that it gets +2/+2 at the end of turn. This ability costs 1 less to cast to activate for each basic land type among lands you control. Activate only once each turn. So, this is an okay card. It's not anything super crazy. It's not anything that's like, terrible. I think it kind of falls in the middle. And I do think the most ideal deck style that you probably want to play this card in is like Jund. Like, to me, I saw this card and I'm like, this is a perfect card for a Jund style deck. And the fact that Jund's kind of like in that middle-ish ground where there's some good cards that definitely can help this card out, make it that much better. This feels really good in the 2-drop slot where you can attack and you can bring it into play on turn 2, follow that up with a decent turn 3 play, and then pretty much, be able to prevent really anything from blocking unless they have multiple blockers, which definitely is very good. And because Jund is a 3-color deck, at least the domain ability will then cost 3 mana instead of 6. So I do think this is a good card in that sense. It may be limited to playing decks that have to play multiple colors. You can't play it really in... You can play it in mono red, but it's not really going to get any sort of benefit outside of getting the additional -1, and that ability then would cost, would cost 5 mana instead of 6, which is still not really that great. We're only +2/+2. But like I said, if you are going to play, 2-color decks or 3-color decks that have red and you're trying to be aggressive, this could be a card that fits there. If you can somehow get a multicolor deck that's more than 3 colors, probably throw some of these in there just because it'll be that much better, just because the more lands you have out, the better this card gets in that sense. But still, it's definitely something that's very limited on what it can do. But I do think it's a card that if you're going to play any deck that has multiple colors, you want 4 of these in your deck, because this is definitely something that your opponent has to deal with immediately, because it's going to be hard to block it if they don't have multiple creatures out to really throw it in front of this card. Now, moving on to green, and to me, this is going to be the best Defiler out of all of them. This is a 5-mana 6/6 trample card. It has the ability that you can pay life instead of paying the green mana cost of your spells, making them only then cost the colorless mana that you still have to pay. Whenever you cast a green permanent spell, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. To me, this seems like the strongest, and this is going to be one of those things that, I think a lot of green decks are definitely going to probably play. I would say this is an easy 4 of, possibilities in a green deck, because I think this is a card you definitely want to hit, because every card you get out of this, after this, will make anything that's bigger or anything that's more expensive that much more worth it to play. In my head, I could see you playing this I would say, you want to probably protect it because it doesn't have any sort of protection. So you probably want to play it on turn 5 if you have like a way to kind of, have mana open for like a safekeeping or something like that. Because think about it, you can play this, and then all of a sudden you pay 4 mana, or you pay 4 life, you play Titan of Industry after this, and all of a sudden you have a 5-mana Titan of Industry with 2 mana open to possibly do other things with. And you gain 5 life back after paying 4 life, so you get a net 1 of +1 life. You then either get a shield counter, a 4/4 creature out of it. You can also get, you can get destroy target artifact or enchantment. Like I said, I think this is the best one. I mean, I could be wrong, but to me, a 5-mana 6/6 that has this ability that, turns like your green stompy creatures into that much, making them that much less the cost with a high upside. I think this is a really, really good card. I think this is a must 4 of if you are someone who plays green, or possibly, a dual color deck that plays green. I even think in Jund this card could see play, because, being able to make your cards cost less to cast is overall benefit to you, just because you get to then get them on the battlefield for 1 less mana, leaving mana open to possibly do other things. Defiler Vigor is my favorite out of all of them. So I would say 4 of. So next card up is going to be Quarkian Beastcaller. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that whenever we cast a creature spell that puts a +1, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Quarkian Beastcaller. Whenever it dies, we get to distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures we control, where X is number of +1/+1 counters on Beastcaller. So to me, this is kind of one of those cards that fits that 2-drop slot in like a mono green deck, because mono green's losing a couple of things. This is, to me, is like, you know, I possibly play turn 1 play, I follow this up with a Quarkian Beastcaller, and then turn 3 I get to play my other creature. Quarkian Beastcaller then goes to a 3/3, then attacks, which is definitely very good. You know, it's a good card. And then on top of that, if they don't exile it, you then get to take, if it does die, you then get to take how many +1/+1 counters it does have, and then distribute them to the rest of the creatures you have out on the battlefield. And like I said, if you can keep the pressure up against any of your opponents and be able to grow this thing over and over again, they have to eventually deal with it at some point, which then maybe gives you the added benefit of you having other creatures on the battlefield that are just as good. And to me, I think this is a 4 of in a deck that plays, you know, any sort of green. You know, if you're playing mono green, if you're playing Jund, if you're playing Gruul, I think this card's great, right? It's a card that gets bigger and bigger the more pressure you can keep on your opponent. You know, it's the more creatures you play, the better this card gets. Like I said, the one downside is if they deal with it immediately, you don't get any value out of it. But if they keep it out on the battlefield and you're able to get, you know, creatures out on the battlefield after you play it, it's going to be a card that's going to get bigger and bigger. Like I said, it's kind of like a card that's a built-in Luminarch Aspirant, but the dependency here is instead of getting guaranteed every turn, you have to play a creature to kind of get that +1/+1 counter on this card. So definitely a good card. Definitely a 4 of, I would say, if you are going to play green in any sort of deck. So the next card up is going to be Silverback Elder. It is a 5-mana 5/7 ape shaman creature that whenever we cast a creature spell, we get to choose one. The first ability is we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. We get to look at the top 5 cards of our library. We put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order, or gain 4 life. So this is also a really, really good card. This is a card that you could play with the Filer of Vigor. You know, you could essentially make it cost less to play. You know, make it cost 4 mana, make it cost 3 mana. If you really want to get risky, you can make it cost, you know, 2 mana and then have mana open to probably follow that up with a creature. It's a great card. You know, it's a 5/7. 7 toughness it blocks a lot. You know, it's a big, tough, you know, body for only 5 mana. And on top of that, you know, you get a net benefit every time you follow this up with a creature, which makes this card that much better. This is kind of, like I said, it's a great card to kind of combine with the Filer of Vigor, just because it is the ability to gain the 4 life whenever you cast a creature card. So it's definitely good there if you're worried about life points. And on top of that, you have other ways to ramp up. You have ways to destroy artifacts or enchantments. It's an overall good card, and I do see why it's a mythic. And like I said, you know, if I really can't predict where you know, mono green is going to go, but I want to make sure I kind of want to draw this, or at least have 2 copies in my deck. I personally would probably try to have 4 copies just to kind of have that flexibility. Like, is this going to be a better play than, you know, spending the mana to play a Titan of Ministry? Probably not, but it's definitely something to experiment with. You know, if you want to play 4 copies of it, it's not legendary, so it's not anything that's super crazy. But like I said, it's not legendary, so you can have as many of these out on the battlefield, and every one net benefits even more. So you can, you know, choose to gain a bunch of life. You can choose to gain some life, destroy an artifact or enchantment, or even, you know, ramp a little bit. So to me, this card's like a win-win. It's kind of one of those things. It is probably really only a mono green card because of the 3 casting cost, but it's a great card, I would say. So definitely, to me, it's a 2 to 4 range, depending on where you value it. But to me, like I said, I probably value it closer to 4. But, you know, 2 is probably enough to have in your collection just to get you started. So the next card up is going to be Threats Undetected. This is a 3-mana sorcery spell that we can search our library for up to 4 creature cards with different names and different powers, reveal them, and opponent chooses 2 of them. 2 of those cards, shuffle the chosen cards into your library and put the rest into your hand. So to me, this is one of those cards where, you know, I think always the best way to kind of, you know, win games too is to make your opponent make the wrong choice. And opponents hate making choices. This is a great card to either, one, they don't know your hand. You don't have to reveal any cards in your hand. So if they don't know your hand, you can get something you already have in your hand that's kind of threatening. If we kind of go over the past few cards we already went over in green, all those cards are very, very good. Outside of the 2-drop, but it's definitely one of those things, like your opponent doesn't want to give you a Silverback Gorilla, it doesn't want to give you the Filer of Vigor, it doesn't want to give you a Titan of Industry. Like, they'll have to make a choice of some sort and give you that. And it's one of those things that you can make them make that choice. And if, you know, you maybe have some of those cards already in your hand, if they pick those cards and go back in your library, it's no big deal. Then you get some other cards that you can definitely play. I really like this card. This is a great card to me. It's like a mono green Fact or Fiction. Like, you can also play it in Gruul. You can also play it in Jund. It's a great card that fits a lot of slots in a lot of decks that play creatures. And it's definitely good to make your opponent make that choice. And like I said, you know, that choice could then screw them over. But I would say, you know, this is probably somewhere in that 2 to 4 range. I don't really know if you want to play 4 copies of this, but you could possibly play 4 copies, but 2 is probably the minimum if you want to make sure, you know, you have some other ways to kind of draw some cards in a green deck, and this is definitely a good way to do so. Next card up is going to be Erbog Lagroif. It's a 2-mana star, +1 star. Has a kicker ability of blue and or black mana. Every time it was kicked, you get to mill 3 cards. You mill 3 cards for each time it was kicked, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in a graveyard +1. So it's a good card, right? It's not something that's really super big and explosive on turn like 2, but it's one of those cards as, you know, the game goes on, creatures die, things like that. This card gets bigger and bigger, and I do think this is kind of one of those cards that, you know, fits in that deck that I feel like has popped up from time to time in this recent rotation. You know, decks where you're milling creatures or cards into your graveyard. This is kind of that card that kind of, you know, takes benefit of it, right? This card gets better for more creatures in your graveyard. It gets bigger as it goes on. It doesn't have anything super crazy. Like, it doesn't have trample, it doesn't have vigilance, it doesn't have like any sort of protection built into the card. But it's a card that your opponent has to deal with, because if it gets too big and you keep on swinging in with it, or find a way to give it trample, or give it like flying or something crazy like that, it's going to get out of hand very, very quickly. And I really, really like this card in that sense. And I do think there's a deck that probably revolves around, you know, self-milling yourself and then kind of getting benefits from self-milling yourself. So I really like Erbog. It's probably like somewhere in the, if you're playing a deck that's going to be playing around this type of like deck type, you probably want 4 of. But, you know, having a couple copies in your collection is always very good too. I could see it, even see him play in like a, you know, a regular creature deck, even if you don't kick spells, because if your opponents, if creatures die and they're in your graveyard, it's still going to be a decent sized creature for only 2 mana. So it's not a bad card. It is kind of limited on what it can do, but it can be very good overall in general. Next card we get into is King Darian the 48th. I actually had to look that up because I didn't know it in Roman numerals. But to me, this is actually a pretty decent card, right? It's a 3 mana 2/3 that gives other creatures control +1/+1. For 5 mana, you can put a +1/+1 counter on King Darian and create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. And then you get to also sacrifice King Darian. Creature tokens we control gain hexproof and indestructible end turn. I really like this card. It's kind of like, you know, it's a very unique card in a way that's kind of like a Glorious Anthem built into a card. It does have a mana sink ability as well. It is a 3 mana, only 2/3, which is not anything super great, but it's kind of, you know, it's kind of one of those cards that helps protect your creatures. To me, this is a card that pairs up very well with like a thing like a wedding announcement, as that creates tokens, and the other cards of the format that also create tokens. This could be a good card to kind of play in like a token style deck. I really like King Darian. To me, because it's legendary, you probably only need like 2 to 3 copies. To me, you know, it's not one of those things you want 4 copies, because you don't want to always draw it, because if you already have one out, you can't play another one unless you attack with it or already sacrifice it. But to me, this is probably in that 2 to 3 range. It's a good card. It's, you know, it's not bad even in like a Selesnya deck that plays a mixture of creatures and or tokens. You know, could see play in like a Selesnya enchantments deck, because those tokens then would get additional +1/+1. So it's a cool card. You know, it's definitely unique. Like I said, it's not a must-have that you need 4 copies of, but it's in that 2 to 3 range. Overall, good card. Next card up is going to be Ratchabik the Erbog. It's a 4 mana 3/3 Vigilance Ward 2 zombie wizard legendary creature. It gives other zombies you control Vigilance. Whenever another legendary creature you control dies, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, and it's a 2/2 black zombie creature token in addition to its other types. This is an interesting card, right? I really like this card. It's, you know, technically it seems like it's a very zombie card, but I think that the thing here is that this card's more of, hey, I want to play a mixture of like legendary creatures, maybe some zombies. But the thing is, it turns those then legendary creatures into creatures when they die. I really like this card, right? You complete this with, you put this with like an Edgar. It's very unique in that sense, right? Edgar could die. That becomes like technically the artifact. It's, you know, it's one of those things that's, you know, very interesting in that sense. Like every time Edgar dies, you then get the coffin, but then technically you then get another copy of Edgar. So then those tokens then get the additional +1/+1. It's very unique, and those Edgar copies aren't technically legendary, so then you can have as many as you want of those. And then there's zombies, so then they have vigilance. So it's a unique card in that sense. And like I said, it benefits also playing zombies alongside of it. Maybe there's a way that you play like Esper zombies. I'm not really sure, but to me, there's really this is the only zombie that you would want to play in white, which is not a bad way to splash. Even if you're playing mono black zombies and you splash a little bit of white to then play this card is also very good. Itself also has Ward 2, which gives it, you know, it's decent protection just in general from, you know, removal, because your opponent has to then pay additional 2, which is pretty good. But I really like this card. I would say it's probably like somewhere in that 2 to 3 range. You probably don't need more than 3, because once you have one out, it's okay. I don't want 4 of, it's not something that's always going to be super effective. It's very unique in what, lines you can get with it. But I do think this is probably in that 2 to 3 range because you want to have a couple copies in your deck if you actually have a splash of zombies and or a splash of zombies and or legendary creatures. And I do think that's probably where it falls when it comes to numbers wise. Next card up is going to be the Soul of Wind Grace. This is a 4 mana 5/4 creature that's legendary. It's a cat avatar. And the one thing I do like about Dominaria United is that they gave like some added benefits to some 3-color cards, as there's a bunch of multicolor 3-color legendary creatures, which kind of to me, sees like the sign that they kind of want to give like the 3-color families that kind of came out of Streets of New Capenna additional stuff. And to me, this is probably one of the better ones out of all of them. This one is like I said, a 4 mana 5/4 that whenever it enters the battlefield and or attacks, you get to put a land card from a graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under our control. And the thing here is this is probably a card you want to splash in with the search lands where they come in the battlefield tap and immediately sacrifice, which then allows you to go into your deck and find a land type and then bring it out to the battlefield. To me, that's kind of where this card kind of falls in. That's kind of like a unique loop you can kind of do with it. On top of that, you can discard a land card, you gain 3 life. You can discard a land card for 2 mana and draw a card. And for 3 mana, you can discard a land card and give it indestructible in a turn and then tap it. I really like this card. I think this one has a lot of utility. Some of the other ones are kind of unique. I think the one that's kind of like one of those ways you have to kind of find a sacrifice fodder for is I think it's the Esper one, because it has 2 trigger abilities, and then if you get to the 3rd ability, your opponent gets the card, and you don't really want them to have the card. But still, this one's probably, to me, like I said, it's the best. It's kind of one of those things that kind of allows you to discard things with the discard a land ability, then you have to bring it back, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then kind of be able to use that land maybe as discard fodder again. Definitely a cool card. It's 4 mana for a 5/4 is really, really good. And just like I said, it's a way to kind of get some additional value out of cards that you may discard into your graveyard and then bring back on the battlefield, not only when it enters, but also when it attacks, makes this card that much better. And the last card up in my list of cards that I think that you should probably look into crafting is going to be Plaza of Heroes. Now, to me, the pain lands are pretty obvious. Like, those are cards you definitely want to have craft or make sure you have in your collection, just because dual lands are going to be very beneficial overall, just to have in general, just because dual lands help you kind of be able to be aggressive, or especially turn from a budget deck into more of a deck where you put a little bit more effort into. But to me, out of like the other non-basics that got released in the set, especially in the rare slot, I like Plaza of Heroes because, one, it's a land that enters the battlefield. It creates colorless mana, which is not anything spectacular. The second tap ability is that you can tap, add 1 mana of any color, spend that mana to only cast legendary spells. That's really good, right? It's kind of like a filter land. If you have a legendary spell you want to cast, you can tap it. It'll create 1 of that mana. Maybe it's some mana that you don't have. If you're playing zombies, you could have Plaza of Heroes in your out on the battlefield. Play that, in a mono black deck, be able to play that mono black white zombie, which is also very good. It also has the ability that, this is going to be a card you're going to see a ton of play in Commander, because add 1 mana of any color among legendary permanents you control. So it turns your this land into a command tower, essentially, not just for Commander, but also for Standard, based on, the legendary creatures you control, which is definitely very good. Or permanents you control, I should say, not just creatures. On top of that, which makes this card pretty unique, is the fact that this kind of combines well with the legendary lands that got released with Kamigawa. So if you have one of those out on the battlefield, this card will gain that ability. So if you have like the green one, you have the white one, the blue one, the red one, the black one, whichever color one you have on the battlefield, this turns into whatever that land is. So if you have multiple of them out, like 1 of each color, you'll get that ability, which makes, to me, I really, really like that as well. And on top of that, you can tap 3, tap it, exile it, target legendary creature control gains hexproof and indestructible in a turn, which is not a bad trade-off as well. If you have a legendary creature you want to protect, the land has a built-in ability that you can protect it with said card. So this is a really good card. I think it has a lot of flexibility. And the fact that we also have legendary lands that are in the format as well, it will make this card that much better, because it, if you had to put down your Otawara, this is now an island. If you have another legendary creature out, it's whatever 2 colors that legendary creature is. So to me, this is going to be a card that I would say you want to have 4 of, right? I think this is probably the best dual land / monocolor land in the format. It gains a lot of benefits. I could be wrong, but the thing here I see the upside with it is we don't have to pay life. It doesn't come into play tapped. Those are 2 great things, and it's definitely a card that I see make most lists. You'll probably see this card at least, a couple copies of, but I would personally play 4 copies because it's not legendary. I can have as many out on the battlefield, and it'll produce whatever mana there is on the battlefield based on, the various triggers that do the said things. But with that being said, this is my list. It's all opinionated. I haven't tested any of it. I think when this video goes up, the previews will be happening where people will be playing the new format and new standard. So, things could change as we get a better and better developed meta. But, you know, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If there's any cards that are in the rare and mythic slots that I didn't go over that you think, you know, maybe I should take a look at again just to see if I maybe missed something, let me know in the comments below. If you're new here, you want to know what post new videos on the channel like this one, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.